Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, we ask you to meet us here as we gather together in Christ's name, bringing with us what we have. May you shape that so that we may bear fruit in the days ahead. Amen. Back to Jacob, back to the story of Jacob. When he lays his head on a stone to rest in the place that he's going to call Bethel, it's the first time that he appears by himself in the narrative. Until this point, he's always been mentioned with family members and other characters. He's kind of been surrounded by people. He's been one of a number of primary characters in this ongoing story of Abraham and Isaac and now Jacob. This is the first time we see him relatively alone. He is fleeing his brother Esau, who is understandably angry with him for a number of reasons. We talked about one of those reasons last Sunday. And he's finding rest, he's seeking sanctuary in what may have been at the time an ancient sacred site. It says that he comes to a certain place. It doesn't lay out what this is, but it makes it sound like he was looking for a particular place to rest and find refuge, even though he doesn't even have a pillow to lay his head on. He has to go find a stone, which hardly feels comfortable. But he finally gets to sleep, and he has a dream, and in that dream he has a vision. We often talk about this vision as the vision of Jacob's ladder. The Hebrew here is not really a ladder, it's more of like a stair, like a staircase. And so imagine in the ancient world there were these buildings that were called ziggurats. Have you ever heard this word before, ziggurat? Okay, well, I'm going to help you. Imagine a ziggurat is like a big rectangle with a slightly smaller but still big rectangle stacked on top of it lengthwise, and then another slightly smaller but still very big rectangle, and then maybe another rectangle at the very top, kind of like a lumpy pyramid. And up the sides of the ziggurat would have been stairs. And in the ancient world, a ziggurat was a picture of the world. It was a microcosm of the world, where at the top of the ziggurat were the gods. And then the different layers of the ziggurat represented layers of people. And so at the very bottom are the regular folks like us. And the only people who could climb the ziggurat to the top, like if just a regular person just climbed those steps to the top, you'd be killed in probably a very dramatic way. The only people who could climb to the top of the ziggurat would be a priest or a king. In both cases, a sacred person. Because they were seen as the connection between all of us at the bottom and the gods, the divine, at the top. And so Jacob has a vision of something like this, where there is a stair that's going up to heaven, and there are messengers that are coming up the stair and down the stair. The word for these messengers, of course, for us would be angels, angelos, just people who carry a message. So these messengers are scurrying up and down, and you picture Jacob looking, at the base of this ziggurat maybe, and then up to the heights where presumably the gods would be. And then right next to him is God. Kind of going like, right? Wasn't expecting that. Because he's looking at the top to see God, but God comes and stands right next to him and has a conversation with him. Not through the messengers that are traveling up and down the heavenly staircase. Those are just like an illustration. They have no part in this story. The story is a story of a conversation between Jacob and God. And they have this conversation, and during this conversation, God takes the promises that God had made to Abraham and to Isaac, and then officially transfers those promises to Jacob. This is where he inherits all of this. He becomes the father of the family the way that Abraham and Isaac had been before him. And God says that I will do all that I have promised to your grandfather and to your father. I will continue doing those things, and just like them, your descendants will spread throughout the earth and be a blessing. All the promises that had been made are remade and retold between God and Jacob. And God also says that actually wherever you go, I will be there. Not if you come back to this sacred place, I'll be here waiting for you. But wherever you go in your life, in your journeys, I will be there with you. In the text, in the Hebrew, this is one of the rare times when God's name is used. Not like a title for God, as is more common. Because when this was written, this is an old text, and when this was written, there wasn't yet the tradition of not saying God's name, Yahweh. And so God is named in this text Yahweh. And it's Yahweh and Jacob having a conversation. So Jacob wakes up and is thrown and terrified and inspired by awe. And he doesn't have a lot that he can do to mark this location. Like, he doesn't have the resources to build a shrine or to build a temple. And so he takes the stone he had as his pillow and tips it up so that it's sort of, I picture kind of a small pillar, like not a huge obelisk, right? Because his head had to fit on it. So he tips up the stone, settles it, and then gets oil and just kind of dumps some oil on it to consecrate it. Both as a way of marking it as sacred, the same way you might consecrate a king or a prophet or a priest with oil, he consecrates the stone. But also, if you think about it, in the middle of nowhere, in the bone-dry desert, if you saw a stone that was like glistening with oil on it, it would stand out. And so it's a way for him to mark this stone as different from probably a million other seemingly identical stones all around it, as a way to mark this place as visible and sanctified, a place where the transcendent, the being at the top of the ziggurat, and the immanent, all the people at the bottom, came together. Where Jacob didn't have to send a messenger running up the steps to get an answer from God to come back down the steps and tell him. While he was watching the messengers going to and fro on their business, God was right next to him, speaking to him as a friend, as a confidant, promising that he would be present wherever Jacob goes. Which is good, because Jacob is still on the run from his brother, so he needs to leave like in the morning. Bethel, the name that he gives this sacred place in Hebrew, means God's house. Bet, house, El, God. And in Hebrew, and in the Hebrew scriptures, there are actually a lot of places that are God's house. There are a lot of places that are sacred places, of which this is one, and this is a very important one. But in the Hebrew scriptures, we have, by my count, at least 3 sacred mountains on which God might be found. And you had multiple sacred spaces that people used, who would travel to, shrines, standing stones like this. There was, of course, Jerusalem, but Jerusalem was one of many sacred places until after the Babylonian exile, and the Hebrews come back, and they kind of centralize what's going on at that point, and Jerusalem becomes the center of their faith for hundreds of years after that. But at this time, when Jacob names Bethel, Bethel, Jerusalem is just one of many sacred sites. It was a site that was in active use as a sacred site for at least about 2,000 years, possibly more. So it didn't stay an oil-splashed stone in the desert forever. It was conquered by the Romans and was a ruin for a very long time. But recent archaeological digs have found the remains of medieval churches that were built on the location of Bethel hundreds of years after it was thought to be erased from history. It isn't mentioned in Roman histories after about the 300s. But 1,000 years later, there were churches still flourishing there. And over time, there was conflict. We'll get there. So Bethel began. The first time Bethel is mentioned is as a stopping point on Abram's journeys through the ancient world. And then it's the place where Jacob has his vision of Jacob's ladder or of Jacob's stairway. It's also the place where Jacob, coming back before he's going to face his brother, fleeing his brother, he comes to Bethel and then runs. Coming back, he comes to Bethel, sends everyone ahead of him, and then wrestles God. This is the place where Jacob will wrestle God, where Jacob will be wounded, where he will also receive a new name and a new identity from God before he limps his way back to face his brother. It's a place where people have found rest and where they've been able to struggle, have even endured pain, but also found new identity and new hope when they come to God's house. And over time, there's conflict over the use of Bethel. Different people want to use it for different purposes. There are even people who come to Bethel to worship new gods. There are other prophetic traditions that grow up around Bethel and compete with prophetic traditions in the Hebrew world. It becomes a place of compromise, a place of even corruption. And the question of who will be worshipped at Bethel is an ancient question. Will it be Baal or will it be Yahweh? And there are nationalist questions as well about Bethel. Who's going to own it? Whose sacred site is it? Does it belong to Judah or does it belong to Israel? After the exile, there's a time of revitalization and renewal where the old gods are cleared out of Bethel. It's once again consecrated to Yahweh. And then here we are in the present, looking at all of this history, the different issues around this place, this house of God, and trying to make sense of what it's going to mean for us. And I hope that some of this seems familiar. As people who have grown up, many of us, in God's houses in various places in the world. This idea that it's a place of sanctuary, it's a place of rest, it's also a place of struggle. It's a place that can be compromised, corrupted. There can be controversies that arise, even now, in this house of God. Obviously, this morning, we are gathered in a house of God. I say a house of God because it's one of many. Just as Bethel was one of many, it isn't the only one. It's a house of God because it is a place where God appears. God shows up, and that's how you know. Just like the way that Jacob knew he was in God's house after the fact, because God showed up. We know a place is God's house because God shows up. And so God's house could be a vast golden cathedral covered in white marble and beautiful stained glass everywhere, or God's house could be an oily stone in the desert where you laid your head because you were running away from your angry brother. To me, the most striking thing about the house of God, about God's house, and the thing I look for when I'm looking for a place that might be God's house, the most striking thing is the lack of separation. That God doesn't appear above us, out of reach. And so we have to choose an intermediary to go bring our message to God and then wait for the intermediary to come back with the message from God for us. It's God's house because God shows up. Could be sitting next to us, as close to us as a friend, as close to us as our breath. And we still have the complicated history, maybe issues with nationalism, maybe theological differences, competing traditions. But when we come to God's house, I think we're very much like Jacob. We're looking for a place where we can bring our everyday life, the burdens and the challenges and the hopes that we have. Maybe it's like him, fear of a sibling, or the need for rest. Maybe it's just a need for a safe place for a while. We bring all the complications in our lives, our complicated families, no less so than Jacob's. Our hopes, our fears. We bring all these things with us when we come looking for God's house. And we hope to find God standing next to us or sitting next to us. To experience again God's promised presence. Not just in a particular place, but wherever we go. And when we find that, place where God meets us, we have found God's house. Amen.